Welcome to Summer of Sport. Hello, I'm Tim and I have too many books. This video is for a BookTube event called Summer of Sport. It is hosted by Mark from Booktime with Elvis and Steve Donoghue, with co-hosts Greg from Another Big Profile Reads, Alan from Big Hard Books, Melissa from Time Travel Reads, Bill Ruttenberg, Debs from Rainer Reads Stuff, Randy Ray the Literate Texan, Shawn Standfast, Joe Spivey and Linda from Elder Talk. The object of the event is to read a book or books about sport or sports if you prefer, but there is one caveat, and that is do not include anything to do with hunting. I have a horrible feeling I might have broken this rule. So what we're going to get here is my usual mix of books I've read which I can recommend and books that I've put on my TBR because I like the sound of them. And I have to admit that one or two books are here because of movies and television. We're going to start with a couple of defunct sports. The very first is walking marathons, also known as pedestrianism. Obviously there are walking marathons today, but those only ever last a few hours. In Victorian times, these walking marathons would last days. In 1870, the length of a pedestrian race or walking marathon was set at about 6 days, during which time the competitors had to walk as far as possible. The book I've chosen is Wobble to Death by Peter Lovesey. This is the first of Peter Lovesey's Sergeant Cribb novels, which takes place during an indoor pedestrian event and murder is afoot. Several other Sergeant Cribb novels take place with sport or leisure pursuits such as boxing or rowing. The Sergeant Cribb novels were dramatised in the 1970s, starring Alan Doby as Sergeant Cribb and William Simon as his put-upon deputy Constable Thackeray. The next sport is dance marathons, and the book is They Shoot Horses, Don't They? By Horace McCoy. These dance marathons were especially popular in the United States during the 20s and 30s, and during the Depression they were often seen by some people as a way out of poverty. The reality was that these dance competitions would often be taking advantage of very, very desperate people. They could go on for weeks, if not months, and it wasn't too uncommon for people to die during the events. This novel takes inspiration from Horace McCoy's experience as a bouncer at a number of dance marathons. The novel is about an unsuccessful screenwriter who enters a dance marathon to try to earn some money. It was made into a film in 1969 starring Jane Fonda. The next sport is cricket. The book I've chosen is 500 to 1 by Rob Steen and Alastair McLellan. For the uninitiated, cricket is a game where somebody throws a ball at a group of sticks called a wicket, and there is a batter or batsman who is standing in the way trying to hit the ball all over the playing field. Unlike baseball, instead of facing just 6 legal balls in an innings, a batsman can face multiple balls, although they are broken up into 6-ball overs. International matches, known as test matches, last for 5 days. They consist of a total of 4 innings. An innings is usually where each of 11 players will face the other team's bowling until the whole team is out. Teams are usually made up of about 6 specialist batsmen and 5 specialist bowlers. The bowlers are not necessarily good batsmen, but they can be. And if they're really good at batting and bowling, they're often referred to as all-rounders. The oldest international competition in cricket is the Ashes series. It's called the Ashes because after a particularly bad loss to the Australians in the 1870s, somebody burnt part of a wicket, the bails, and put them in a little urn. This urn is the Ashes trophy and has been fiercely competed for over the last almost 150 years. 500 to 1 is the tale essentially of the adventures of 3 cricketers. We start with Mike Brearley, who as a batsman was just about good enough to get into the England team. But it was as captain in the late 70s that he really excelled and put a spring into the step of the England team. He retired in 1980 and lessened his involvement in cricket, retraining as a psychoanalyst. The next player is Ian Botham. Ian Botham, possibly one of the greatest cricket players ever. He's an all-rounder, and if he's on your team and he's in top form, you've probably won already. When Mike Brearley retired in 1980, it seemed obvious to give Ian Botham a shot at being captain of England. Obvious, but a very, very bad decision. Ian Botham, when he was captain, never won a match. Worse than that, it appears that the strains of captaincy made Ian Botham's form begin to slip. In 1981, after failing to win the first 2 matches in the Ashes Test Series against Australia, Ian Botham resigned as captain. Quite possibly just before he was going to be sacked. England decided to recall their lucky captain, Mike Brearley. His form had slipped as well. He was no longer good enough to be a batsman in the England cricket team, but he was felt to be a good captain. Mike Brearley took over for the 3rd Test match in Headingley, Leeds, and things didn't really go very well. The Australians set a very high first innings score, almost 400, and England came into bat and scored less than half. At this point, the Australians saw a chance for victory, and they decided to force what is known as the follow-on. A follow-on is where England would play their second innings immediately after their first, and it's a very difficult position to come back from. If they were bad enough to score less than half of Australia's score in the first innings, well, maybe they'll get less than half of Australia's score in the second innings, and Australia won't have to play their second innings. At the end of the second day, England had just lost 2 wickets in their second innings. Things were looking extremely bad. A scoreboard on the ground put up the latest odds for the match. 1-4, an Australian victory. 5-2, a draw. And 500-1, an England victory. It's a little bit of a spoiler that this book is called 500-1, Miracle at Headingley. But you may enjoy how it gets there. I mentioned that there are 3 cricketers playing a large part in this match. And the third is this guy with the Brian May haircut, Bob Willis. He's a bowler. The next sport is golf, and the book I have chosen is P.G. Wodehouse's Golf Omnibus. This is 31 short stories about golf written by P.G. Wodehouse. Some of these stories involve a character called the Oldest Member, who sits at the 19th hole and regales people with stories of love, humour and golf. This omnibus was first put together in the early 1970s when P.G. Wodehouse was still alive, and in his preface to this edition he does mention that some of his language is now somewhat out of date, especially the name of the golf clubs, which used to go by such names as the Spoon, the Brassy, the Mashy and the Niblick, and even the Mashy Niblick. This particular version of the Golf Omnibus is published by Hutchinson, and Hutchinson published a large number of other P.G. Wodehouse omnibuses with the same basic design language and the same rather large format. Next we have football, or soccer if you prefer, and I have chosen The Damned United by David Peace. We're in 1974 and Leeds United is one of the best and the most reviled teams in the English First Division. They play well, but they often play dirty. Their success and their general attitude has been masterminded by their manager Don Revie, but he has left to become manager of the England team. Leeds United have to find a new manager to take over the team and cope with pugnacious characters like the team captain Billy Bremner. The man who's selected is called Brian Clough. He's a former player and a promising up-and-coming manager of football teams. He's also one of the most arrogant and mouthy people on the planet. So can this mouth on legs beat The Damned United? We'll have to read it to find out. We now turn to American football, and the choice I've made is Semi-Tough by Dan Jenkins. This was made into a film starring Burt Reynolds, Chris Christopherson and Jill Clayburgh. But reading the blurb about the book, I'm not sure that it's entirely faithful to the book. Sports Illustrated magazine listed Semi-Tough as the 7th best sports novel ever written. It tells the story of Billy Clyde Puckett, the captain of the New York Giants and the team's halfback. He's going into a Super Bowl against the Jets. At the same time, he's been commissioned to write about the build-up to the Super Bowl and has employed a ghostwriter to help him with his writing. We move on to baseball, and we have Underworld by Don DeLillo. This starts with a very vivid evocation of the 1951 Giants-Dodgers match for the pennant. After some very interesting description of some celebrities by Don DeLillo, he focuses on a young boy who catches a ball that is batted out into the stands. He then traces the movement of that ball through various owners over the next 40 years. I read this book quite a long time ago, but I still remember it with great affection, and I think I might take the excuse to read it again over the summer. Our next sport is polo, and I've chosen the book Polo by Jilly Cooper. This is a third of her so-called Rutshire Chronicles. These are tales of upper crust equestrian folk who, when they're not spending time riding their horses, are riding each other. We focus on two characters. Ricky France Lynch is a polo player. He's upper crust, a landowner. He has a broken down country house to try to keep up and a wife to try to control. We also see a 14-year-old girl called Perdita, who is an up-and-coming polo player and utterly devoted to Ricky. My next choice of book is probably going to get me disbarred from this particular BookTube event, because I'm focusing on horse racing, which at least one of the hosts of this event has called overly cruel and likened it to hunting. I'm not sure I agree, but I see their point. But all the same, I think this is a very interesting book and author to talk about. My choice is Dead Cert by Dick Francis. Dick Francis was a former champion natural hunt jockey, and when he retired, he turned to writing books. These books were mostly thrillers set in and around the horse racing world. His books seemed to come out almost every year and were hugely popular at the time. It wasn't until his wife died that a possible controversy came up about Dick Francis's writing. Dick Francis had always said that his wife was absolutely vital to his research into his books. She even learned how to fly simply so that flying sequences could be included in some of Dick Francis's books. Dick Francis always said that he would have been quite happy to include her as a co-author. Mary Frances gained her degree in English literature at the age of 19 and worked in publishing as a reader. After her death, Dick Francis didn't write any more books for a while until his son, Felix, took over co-writing duties with him. So it does look as if in this relationship between Dick and Mary Frances was actually doing the bulk of the writing, and Dick Francis was the person putting in the racing colours. I do find his books well worth a read, and it does seem that Mary Frances was not too worried about being credited for all the work that she probably did on them. The story of Dead Cert revolves around Alan York, who is an amateur jockey and private investigator who witnesses the death of a friend and rival called Bill Davidson, riding a horse called Admiral. Admiral is a possibility for Britain's premier national hunt race, the Grand National, and it looks as if Bill Davidson was murdered. As I said before, a lot of my choices for this sport list have been inspired by films and television adaptations of these books, and there was an adaptation of Dead Cert made in 1974. One of its stars is Judi Dench, who is making one of her only major film appearances throughout the 1970s. Judi Dench has long been a very, very successful actress. She was, at the time, in the 1970s, the absolute queen of the English stage. But her film work is very few and far between until the 1990s. Another thing that makes this film a bit of a curiosity is the sex scene featuring Judi Dench. I say sex scene, but it is mostly implied, and you do have to use an awful lot of imagination. But yeah, it's a nice trivia point if you ever want to upset major Judi Dench fans. Our last sport is boxing, and the book choice is Black Ajax by George MacDonald Fraser. This is somewhat of a departure for George MacDonald Fraser, moving away from the Victorian time period and moving away from his main character, Harry Flashman. But a large part of this novel sequence is narrated by Harry Flashman's father, Buckley Mad Buck Flashman. Mad Buck Flashman wants to be seen as a little bit of a man about town in Regency London. And he decides to briefly sponsor a young boxer who has come from New Orleans. This is Tom Molyneux. Tom Molyneux was born a slave, got his freedom and came to Britain to take on the British champion, Tom Cribb. No relation to Sergeant Cribb for my first choice. Mad Buck Flashman introduces Tom Molyneux to Bill Richmond, another boxer and former slave from the United States. Bill Richmond was a champion boxer in his own right and agrees to take on Tom Molyneux and train him up to take on Mr. Cribb. I won't spoil what happens in the novel, but what happens in later life to Tom Molyneux is a little bit unfortunate. He dies of pneumonia. He dies after a night of drinking in the company of a couple of black soldiers at the age of 36. The mention of Bill Richmond might spark a little bit of recognition from Bridgerton fans, because in Bridgerton we have a former boxer, a former champion boxer, who goes by the name of Will Mondrich. Not Richmond, Mondrich. Yes, he is supposed to be based somewhat on the character of Bill Richmond. So that's my picks for Summer of Sport. Books I want to read and books that perhaps you ought to look into reading yourselves. Enjoy.